I think we are ready to start with the panel discussion and with the Q&A liaison with the audience. So I would like to invite Luciana, Laura, and Rosen on the stage. And if we can have the results from the second question from Slido. Super. We have a diversified feedback. Because actually the first topic for the panel discussion I would like to raise is actually on the public perception, on the engagement of stakeholders, and how we can improve this. So possibly next time when we vote to have more green in the neutral and supportive response, and what are the key challenges in this respect? What could be the best examples you can share with us? Luciana, maybe you can start first, and then Laura and Rosen follow up. And please, from the audience, if anybody would like to step in and to contribute, we are more than welcome to do so.
Thank you. I would actually like to know who said supportive, if anybody's in the room that responded that the public is supportive. I'm just very curious, but I guess they're not here. They just voted and then they left so they wouldn't have to explain. Right, the main challenges, I think there's quite a few, but the biggest one is obviously lack of awareness. And this isn't just about CCS, but it's about climate change in general. So you mentioned in the introduction that when CCS was first started in the US in the 1970s, it was very much a business opportunity. It was about enhancing oil recovery, whereas in Europe, when it started, it was very much a decarbonization measure, and this is how it's remained since then. Now, obviously, we have different attitudes towards climate change across Europe, and I personally think that one of the reasons behind this discrepancy between the West and the East in terms of CCS projects does have to do with this general awareness of climate change, not just on the public side, but also the level of engagement of decision makers, our capacity to formulate coherent climate strategies, where CCS does play a role. So I think that would be the first challenge that I would address, and maybe move on to the panel to maybe, or if you want to say who's next.
Rosen, maybe we can...
Yeah.
So from business perspective, we have invested a lot in engaging local communities, because in any case, cement production is something that relies a lot on local communities, both because people that are working at the plant come from these communities, and also because of the perception being super important for our day-to-day operations. Over the years, we did have challenges in various aspects that we have been managing so far, and the approach that we have adopted is to manage expectations and to manage stakeholders' opinion looking forward. So, talking about CCS, for me it would be super important if we start investing in that way before CCS becomes a reality, and that's our approach as a business. Now, whether the process is going to be smooth and easy, definitely not. But for me, that's a common, both common interest and common task of industries and institutions to work together in the same direction. And as I said, rather early than late, because with public perception running behind the train is never a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Laura?
I totally agree that this is the responsibility both for the public and private sector to communicate, to raise the awareness, and to get rid of those biases. And probably when thinking practically how that can be done, one thing is to talk, to explain, but unless the society would see something happening, they won't believe that it's real and safe. So maybe the good start could be implementing some small pilot projects on a small scale to gradually introduce with the sector, and also to showcase those projects that are in other countries happening or in quite a high level of readiness, to also get them talking with the society, that what's happening there, and of all those pluses, minuses, and what has been done.
And also looking at the results from the Slido here, I'm starting to think that actually, well, the question is quite general about public perception, but if we want to segment the different stakeholders like institutions, businesses, and citizens, maybe we will end up with different results for the different stakeholders, considering their knowledge, their experience, and their interest into these technologies. And as Rosen said, maybe it's also a huge difference between, for example, the citizens' opinion, if we consider a local community where you have an important asset like a plant, and for which this CCS is the way forward to decarbonize and basically stay in the area and in the business, or whether we are making the survey for stakeholders group that are not directly, involved or affected by this decision. What do you think? I mean, have you seen this variation and diversification in public perception? And how do you think it could be a valid also explanation, meaning that somebody from the audience comes, from a different stakeholders group? That's why we have these different. Luciana?
Yeah, it's entirely possible, and the work that we did in the CCS for CE project did show that on the one hand you have citizens, and some of them, it depends on what the stake of the stakeholder is in a CCS project. How does it affect them? So a community that's dependent on a cement factory with the knowledge that the cement factory might close if we don't implement this would obviously be supportive. We also need to talk about the storage part as well, because this is where we see the biggest public opposition, where again there's a big difference between acceptance at sort of we call it a socio-political level of acceptance, where there might be broad social consensus that climate change is real, we need to do something for it, CCS is a solution. But when it comes to the local level, a CO2 storage site in my backyard, I might actually be opposed to that. And I think that what Laura was mentioning about pilot projects is really quite important, because I think even for stakeholders who are more informed than citizens, like national authorities and so on, actually seeing projects in action, seeing that this is possible. We don't have very many projects right now in Europe, but we have, for example, the Northern Lights project in Norway, and we did a study trip there last year where we brought some people also from the ministries in Romania. And it was really fascinating to see when you go to the Breivik cement plant and you see the absorber towers that have been brought on site. They're going to be put up. They're actually going to start capturing CO2. It is real. It can be done. And I think that will be very, very important to engage the public more and to make this seem like something that can be done rather than something that's a bit of a pipe dream, and it's always been kind of 5 years into the future, 10 years into the future, and it never really has come to fruition in Romania at least. I also think that what Rosen said about engaging early is really, really important. So even before an application is made for funding or so on, the community should have already been engaged. And explained what CCS is, why it contributes, why here, why can't you store it somewhere else? Why can't you store it offshore, away from me? There has to also be that explanation. And here I would be interested also to hear the other panelists' thoughts on who is communicating this, because I think, as I was showing, in Romania at least, there is a high mistrust of government. Government is the least trusted stakeholder. Even the EU is more trusted than the national governments, according to the most recent survey. The top are the army and the church, And then there's academia as well. So there's also a question of who is engaging the public, who is communicating in a non-biased way, because we have examples of opposition from Romania to potential CO2 storage projects that weren't necessarily opposition to the CO2 storage itself, but also towards the company that was planning to do it. So there's that conflation of the technology with the developer that also needs to be overcome. Yeah.
Yeah, that's. I also share this opinion that the communication should be very well planned, because we have a different trust in different communication channels, and it's a basic decision we have to make in order to have the right message to the right audience and have the positive feedback in changing the public perception and attitude.
Yeah, I would maybe just give a quick example here of where public authorities and companies have worked together to manage a potential CCS project and also the public engagement around it. That's the Picasso project in the south of France in the Pyrenees region. So they developed basically onshore CO2 storage project idea as a joint venture involving the municipalities in the region as well. So the closer you are to the people in the communities, the more likely you are to understand them, understand their concerns, and have a communication channel already open with them, as opposed to a project developer, you know, that maybe doesn't have operations in the region just yet, but is coming in trying to do something new. So the Picasso project is a good example of that, of how authorities and the developers can work together to engage the communities.
Yeah. Rose and Laura, if you would like to add.
Yeah, it would be interesting how the survey results would come out if we do a survey around Latvia, for example. Those who are living near the Schwenk cement plant, that's is a workplace for hundreds of people there. So I assume that they would be the supportive part, most likely, or at least neutral. And then the rest of the society and those who live near those potential CO2 storage sites, then it's a different game. And again, we have this natural gas storage since Soviet times, and still we are not perceiving storage solutions as something that's another actually product a country has. Latvia is not rich of oil, gas, or whatever natural resources, but this actually is something that's is comparative advantage for a country that can be utilized and developed. But this this perception is not common among society. So it starts with the personal level. What's for me there? If that cement plant is giving work for me, I'm earning some salary, then I'm supportive. If not, then why? I don't need it. And yeah. The question raised, who should be communicating that is of course tricky one, because again, the government is, well, 50-50. Some are really supportive and trust what the government says, some not. We had an interesting experience when communicating the offshore wind park development, and we invited NGOs. And the society, the public that was gathered in the public hearing, told that NGO is not trustable because it gets money from Germany, from Germany's NGO. So they were pushed like out, and we were shocked, like, it's an NGO, it's not the government. And it didn't work out for us in that sense. So yeah, I think it's a combination with the government, NGO, the project developer, I don't know who else, church. Don't know, really. It's a hard question, really. Who needs there? I don't think there would be a sole communicator, because every person hears something different from whether the prime minister is speaking about that, or the local politician, or somebody else. But we need to get the buy-in by any case. Otherwise, if we are moving forwards with the project, with the huge society concerns, then it's not going to work out. It would be very, very hard, of course.
Rosen, and your experience?
Well, my experience is that, like I said, message alignment is the first and most important thing, because yes, the channels are important, but before the channels comes the message, and it's very important that it comes the same way regardless from whom. So the institutional part, I also agree with Eva that there might be a difference if we go deeper in the segmentation of public perception. And for me, the institutional part may sound intuitively as the easiest one to get. Why? Because normally the institution should be the one to understand both on intellectual level what is the challenge of CO2 and also what is the impact to the industry if we do nothing. And in Bulgaria, we already see this in a very painful manner with the thermal power plants, exactly for the reason that for many years the difficult communication has not been done, and right now when we see the results of doing nothing, it's very difficult to handle it, and there is no right way. So from this perspective, I believe that on institutional level, the buy-in, the perception should be, again I say should be, from logical perspective easier. In reality, and I put this in the very specific Bulgarian context, in reality there are a lot of challenges, mainly due to the fact that at the institutional level there has been a lot of changes in the last couple of years, and this never helps when you have to start every few months from scratch an important strategic discussion about CO2 capture and storage. I mean, the discussion that goes, like I mentioned earlier, in order of tens of millions of euro investment and years between 5 and 10 for execution. So that's on the institutional side. Just one other practical experience that we have faced so far. The people, they ask very straightforward, simple questions. You know, do you have a proof? Does it work? Does it not work? And so my concern is that with projects like that, which in the majority of cases, especially at the beginning, are stepping on, you know, research papers or old data, it's very difficult to tangibly address the concerns of local stakeholders. And therefore, you know, whether small projects that were mentioned or pilot projects or something that would be able to provide tangible evidence that carbon storage works, especially carbon storage, because capture is less of a concern. It's mainly the transportation and storage. So something that really proves the concept in a tangible manner for the stakeholders would do a great job, would push the things forward big time.
Okay, I was just, you know, a question popped up from my side following what you said. How do you think regulation plays a role in this public perception? Do you think if something is heavily regulated, like if you start with a project for carbon capture, transport and storage, and you say to the public, you know, I have all the permits, each stage is approved, it went lengthy process, it makes it more convincing, or these two are not necessarily, you know, connected? And also, as you said, also if we add the level of trust in the institutions, I mean, how do you see this relation, if any?
Yeah, I think knowledge of what is already in place from a regulatory perspective, for example, the CCS directive, and I don't think this is common knowledge even amongst, for example, environmental NGOs. So we did a webinar a few weeks ago for environmental NGOs, not to say, you all should believe in CCS right now, but to show what is already being done to ensure that CCS is deployed in a safe and efficient way. So I think that if there was that conversation that since 2009 we've had this directive which requires all member states to assess in depth any application for an exploration license, for a storage license. The European Commission also needs to be notified, and they have the opportunity to provide an opinion on it. I think that could help with public perception. It all then depends on how much you trust that the legislation will be enforced appropriately, which I think in Romania and in Bulgaria is a valid concern. You can have legislation, but then not enforce it appropriately. So I think the question would still arise of who's responsible for making sure that the rules are being followed. And I think there was an example of a CCS project, I can't remember if it was Canada or the US, where they actually got the local community involved in monitoring. So it was sort of a citizen science type approach, where after the CO2 was injected, the communities, I think it was farming communities that were surrounding the storage site, they got given monitors, so where they could detect if the CO2 concentration had gone up, indicating a leak in the transport or the transport system or the storage site. And after a few years, they found that people were no longer interested in doing that because it was too much of a hassle for them. So they kind of started trusting that the process was safe. So that could also be an option, is really get the community involved, because they have a stake in this project, right? The risk of anything happening from a storage site is obviously negligible, but it's never zero. So empowering them to take an active role in monitoring what happens and making sure that everything's done safely and securely could be a way forward.
Super, thank you. Do we have feedback from the audience? Somebody who would like to share experience? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Fausto. I work at a consultancy firm in Portugal dedicated to offshore activities. I apologize if my question is rather naive or misinformed. 20 years ago, I worked for the Portuguese Ministry of Environment. At the time, I took contact for the first time with CCS. In Portugal, we were a little bit skeptical because our vision for the future of decarbonization was based on renewable energies and replacement. Now, we were told at the time by our partners in the EU, especially from Eastern Europe, that some industries that they were heavily reliant on would have no chance without CCS of really decarbonizing. My questions are twofold. Is it still true today, and can we maybe look at fuel replacements and, for example, hydrogen be an option for in the future highly intensive processes like steel mills, cement factories? Can they totally decarbonize and CCS then becoming less relevant? Second question, do you think people have a prejudice against the CCS because they have this vision of the product of pollution, some gas being compressed underground near their houses and them not trusting the technology? And as a parenthesis, we never doubted the solid science behind CCS and the geological reliability of all this. It was more of a philosophical vision of the technology. But the S at the time, I never knew if it was storage or sequestration because the two terms were used. My understanding was that sequestration was more like a chemical reaction where the CO2 reacted with some saline structure, not so much the gas being compressed into a storage room. But the question is, do you think if rather than pumping gas into a deposit near people's houses, if you transform it into something else, would that be, people be less reactive to it? And we have a project for offshore removal of CO2 from the ocean with diatom algae that do calcium carbonate, and then these discs come out just as a stone after 6 months of being in the seawater, and I'm sure no one will have an objection of just putting that somewhere as a solid structure rather than pumping gas. Sorry if the questions are too basic, but thank you very much.
Yes, Rosen, please.
So the questions are not basic, they're super important. And the first one I tried to touch in my presentation, but I would repeat it again because it is really, really important. There are industries that you can decarbonize up to a certain level by, choosing your fuel, including hydrogen. However, there is part which you can never decarbonize. And then speaking about cement specifically, this is the part of the emissions that are coming from the decarbonization of limestone in the process of producing clinker and from their cement. So until you have a replacement for cement, which is today not feasible and has not been for centuries, to be produced from something else than limestone, yes, there are trials on industrial level for certain, proportion or a niche product, but in majority, cement is produced from limestone. Limestone in the cement, in the clinker kiln under 1,400 degrees is being decarbonized and there is CO2 which is emitted. So this is process emission that you cannot address through changing the fuel. And therefore, I gave the specific example of cement, but this debate goes on other so-called hard-to-abate industries. And so carbon capture and storage for the moment does not have an alternative. Yes, you can reduce what is captured and stored, and that's exactly the strategy of big industries, not least because carbon capture and storage, let's be honest, that's the most expensive alternative from business point of view. So if we can avoid it, we will, believe me. So from this point of view, carbon capture and storage will remain a determinant of whether an industry is dead or alive beyond 2034. The other point that you made was on
prejudices about storage.
Yes, okay, that's also a very important one. So prejudices are rooted in lack of experience or lack of information. And specifically in the project that we are contemplating in northwest of Bulgaria, there are elements that are helpful, and I'll share them simply because they can be applicable elsewhere. In the vicinity of our plant, basically 20, 30 kilometers from it, there is a liquefied gas storage, which is being stored in limestone rock formations. And this has been operational for many years, and now it's even being extended. So the people that are there, they know that there is liquefied gas storage. From experience, that they know that there is no issue related to it. So taking this line of communication, maybe it would be more digestible to accept that there is another liquefied gas, which in this case is going to be CO2, that can also be stored in the very same geologic formations. So that's one way, for example, to try to approach the perception challenge.
Thank you. Luciana?
Yeah, those were really great questions. I'll repeat what Rosen said. Just to maybe start with the CCU versus CCS public perception. In the work that we did in the CCUS Forum Working Group, we were hearing that CCU is more digestible than CCS by the public from the point of view of, like you said, the idea of pumping something that is, CO2 is talked about as being bad in the context of climate change, right? So it is seen as something that we should be afraid of. And the idea of pumping it underground, even if you have parallels with natural gas storage and so on, that might help, but there still might be that element of this is something that I'm less familiar with, and it's something that's being portrayed as being the reason that our planet is suffocating and so on. So there is that element. And this also happens in countries that are advanced with CCS, by the way. There was a study on, I think it was Norway, actually, on the idea of importing CO2 from other countries to store it in the Norwegian North Sea. And there was opposition from the public to this idea. I think the study was titled "Don't Send Me Your Waste" or "Your Waste Gases." So there is also this idea, which in Romania I do think that is going to be an issue because there's already an issue with waste dumping, landfilling of waste from other countries that export it to Romania. And the idea that Romania would become a dumping ground for the waste CO2 from other countries is something that will be a challenge to address from a public perception point of view. But just to say that this isn't unique to Eastern Europe also, it's something that we can really learn from each other a lot. One other thing that I wanted to mention on the public perception is maybe a bit of an encouragement, even though in Eastern Europe we're starting relatively late with CCS compared to Norway and Netherlands and so on. Denmark, up until relatively recently, there was a lot of opposition to CCS. It wasn't even allowed to store CO2 onshore in Denmark. And from about 2020 until today, we've seen Denmark become one of the leaders in CCS in Europe. And a lot of that has to do with how they engaged in really concerted public dialogue. So they had the Danish Energy Agency and other state actors that were really going and engaging with local communities from very early on. Like you said, that's very important. And now we have Denmark really leading the way in CCS. So it's just as a little bit of encouragement to say that if we start doing this and we start doing it well, we could also, a few years down the line, become leading in CCS in Eastern Europe. The question that you had on sequestration versus storage, those terms are used quite interchangeably when it comes to EU policy. I think the process that you're mentioning, the mineralization of CO2, that's a stage in what happens to the CO2 after you inject it underground. So there's a lot of chemistry that I won't get into, but essentially over a long period of time, the CO2 does eventually mineralize. It reacts with the water or the brine or so on in the formation, and it becomes a rock, essentially. But that occurs over geological timescales. In the initial phase, you are reliant on having a good seal above the storage site. So another thing that might be helpful for public perception is to show that investigations have been done to ensure that you have this rock, essentially, that won't allow CO2 to escape. And if you do storage in a depleted gas reservoir, you already have the evidence there because you've been extracting gas from there and it hasn't escaped, right? So you know that you have that seal that's preventing gas from going to the surface. You can say the same thing would happen with CO2. So that's something that might be helpful also. And I think you had, the first question that you asked, and I'll just finish here, about is it still relevant today that there's some industries that absolutely need CCS? Yes, and cement is one of them. I would point you to this really great publication by E3G. They're a consultancy based out of Brussels. They did something called the CCUS ladder, based on the applicability of CCS to different industries. Where will it be the most needed and where does it make the most sense? And cement is the top of the list. The second, I think, is lime. So lime also relies on this calcination process that releases CO2 into the atmosphere. Also couldn't produce lime conventionally without capturing the CO2. And the other one is oil refining, which I'm not familiar with the chemistry, but there are processes in producing petrochemical substances which the CO2 emissions are inevitable. Steel is a bit lower down, and then the lower you go, you get into gas-fired power plants and coal, where it makes more sense to look for alternative renewable sources than to capture the carbon. Yeah.
Laura, maybe you mentioned pilot projects as one of the ways to work with the public perceptions. Can you share with us some examples of different scale of companies that engage with such projects, how they see also the CCS in terms of market development, also how they this type of investments project strategies fit into the international setup, because as Luciana and Rosen also referenced, we are talking about also a potential for regional cooperation when it comes to CCS.
Mm-hmm. Yes, for now we have started not small scale but large scale with the CCS Baltic Consortium project. But within this project, it can be also derived as a pilot project, because currently that project is built on the plan that the CO2 will be transported elsewhere, not stored in Latvia, particularly in one of those sites that we do have for storage theoretically. So within this project, there derives an opportunity to develop a pilot where some amount could be stored for, let's start for research purposes, and then let's see what happens there, and whether we can increase that amount stored or not, because we as people tend to be against something that's they are not used to, right? And if there would be flying cars, how many of us would get into that car now? Like that's something strange. And the same is with the CO2 storage. So to start small scale and do those joint projects, because both the Schwenk company, the cement plant, and would be gladly to be a partner with the government to have such a pilot, right? Because it's win-win. And we have to search for that options to take a company that has this challenge and the government that has challenge that they are not experienced in, and how to get that data, that feasibility and everything. So there's an opportunities. We just have to take that and develop those projects. Otherwise, it won't happen by itself, right? Someone has to do something, and to join forces with the private sector, I think is the best option. Otherwise, since currently the storage is prohibited, only research purposes are allowed, some injections, so there are not actual industrial scale or privately managed such projects. On the research area there are some, but yeah, I wouldn't call them pilots. So we have this one large scale, which could be divided into several sections, right? Because if we think how much money would be paid to that potential storage where that CO2 would be transported, then maybe it would be a different case if the Latvian government says, oh, that amount of millions of euros would be paid to Norway or some other country. Maybe we could also get that money and provide that storage. But that's a challenge, of course, how to get there.
Luciana, would you like to intervene on regional cooperation and how you see it within the CCS?
Yeah, for sure. I just kind of responding to what Laura said. Indeed, it should be a race, right? It should be a race to provide storage because it will be needed as a service. In Romania, for example, we have great storage potential, and it's sometimes a little bit confusing to see the reaction of oil and gas producers to an obligation to develop storage capacity, because indeed, if not in Romania, maybe Bulgaria is further ahead than we are. They have one more project than Romania does, which is zero. So I think there really needs to be more communication around the business opportunities that CCS presents, and linking a little bit into the public perception side of things as well. What are the benefits that local communities or even the country as a whole would see from CCS? So it's about being transparent with the challenges, but also the benefits that it would bring. Very important to also be transparent about the risks, because no project is risk-free. So being transparent about those and about the way that we're mitigating those risks. But just kind of jumping off of that. In terms of regional cooperation, yes, I think this will be important. I think we need to think about regional infrastructure. This isn't just for CO2, but also for hydrogen and for electricity. I would really like to see at some point just a map of the region, but with the borders removed, in which, without thinking about which country it is or so on, we look at where is the biggest potential and where does it make most economic sense to do green steel, right? Where do we have the potential to produce green hydrogen to then supply to steel plants? Where do we have the potential to develop CO2 storage that cement plants can send their CO2 towards, and so on? And this idea of just approaching this as a region, and from the CO2 storage point of view, the geological formations that offer the storage potential, they don't see any borders, obviously. They cross, a lot of different countries in Central and Eastern Europe. So thinking about where does it make most sense on a regional scale to do this, and then building out the infrastructure that's necessary. Here I would say that the transmission system operators from countries, the ones who will be running the CO2 transport network, they have a big role to play, and it's very important to engage them, because it's not easy to build CO2 pipelines. You can't repurpose existing pipelines like you can for some hydrogen projects. So most of these will need to be new build, and it won't be cheap. And I think it's very important to get it, well, it's essential to get it right from the first time we try it. We won't have a second chance to do it. So this idea of a CO2 transport master plan for Central and Eastern Europe, where you have the Black Sea potentially for offshore storage, you have storage in Romania and some in Bulgaria and Poland also. Then you have the Baltic Sea, if we can manage to do something with the Helsinki Convention. Okay, these are the sinks. Here are the sources. How does it make most sense to draw this map of CO2 transport? So that's, I think, a very important step, is to get the TSOs talking to each other about CO2 transport.
Yes, actually, I mean, for me, coming from the energy sector and looking at the decarbonization, of course, first of the energy sector, then coming to the industry, we already ended up in developing, different models, and we always end up with the need of regional cooperation in order to face the decarbonization challenges. And storage, we are thinking about gas, electricity, and hydrogen because it's our area of scope, but also why not CO2 infrastructure and storages actually could be sustainable concept if they are looked at from the regional perspective, where you have synergies and economies of scale, and also better addressing the needs of various stakeholders. Rosen, can you share with us, I mean, you come from the industry, how this CCS and the project you're having is considered from the business perspective? I mean, how it will sustain the competitive standing of the business, how it will develop over time. I mean, we are talking about a project that will happen tomorrow or in 10 years. How it matches at all with the business case?
So actually I was thinking to go in this direction, but to put it in an even bigger scale from the point of view of government of different states. But I will address first the question from business perspective. For us, we have turned the disadvantage of having to deal with CO2 in a competitive advantage, in the sense, and I mentioned this also in my presentation, in the sense that we do not see a chance for the construction industry if it is unwilling or unable to decarbonize and to go in circularities, to advance in circularity. So our strategy as Holcim has been to turn everything upside down and basically prepare and get ready to be able to offer to our clients or to the construction industry decarbonized solutions. Because it's not, in certain European countries, it's already a reality, but it's not far the moment when the construction norms and regulations will require that buildings are built with decarbonized materials. And at that point, the pioneers or the ones that are well advanced will have the possibility to capitalize on the early efforts that they have put in decarbonization or circularity and turn this into competitive advantages. So that's the perspective of the industry, and that's the perspective of Holcim. Now, I want to take this and turn it into a strategy at national level. And for me, I would like to see our government, Bulgarian, but also various governments in European Union, addressing the topic of carbon capture and storage in exactly the same way, meaning that the ones that are fast enough to build the infrastructure or to enable investments in carbon capture and storage will have achieved two objectives. First, they would have obviously saved and made more competitive their own industry, but maybe they would open a completely new industry, which is carbon storage, which today does not exist. And by being pioneers, and I can only commend Norway for leading the way, can become basically the leaders in this future industry, which is going to be carbon storage.
Aura, you would like to add something from the business perspective?
Yes, sure. That was one thing I was also mentioning, that basically there's new industry countries can benefit of those who have that comparative advantage in those CO2 storage sites. And it takes an understanding and, of course, a lot of investment from the governments to really take that opportunity and to utilize that. So I totally agree. The same is either with the hydrogen or with the CO2. To understand that the world is changing and there are new industries appearing, and that who would be the first one or the first ones would benefit the most, of course, because as you saw also in the map presented by Luciana, there are not so many CO2 storage potential in the countries. So, and if we develop those cross-border projects, because the European money is specifically devoted large amounts for cross-border projects, as if we really delete those borders and to take that money and to build that infrastructure that's needed, and there are specific countries, one of which is Latvia, which can become a hub for CO2 storage. But then again, we have to also change our perception that we are seeing this as an opportunity to provide that service, not becoming garbage for other countries. So, but that's a perception, how we look at that, right? So, yeah, there are many opportunities, and that the one who will utilize them the first would benefit the most, right?
Yeah, I think it's a good wrap up of the exchanges. Do we have any intervention from the audience? Okay, then we have the third Slido question for you. If you're more comfortable to contribute, can you? It's an open keyword answers. If you can share what are the top 3 priorities, challenges to CCS technologies that need to be addressed, and the same goes to the panelists. Who would like to start first? Rosen? Top 3 challenges, the most urgent ones.
Well, the first challenge I had the opportunity to share with you during the break. The first challenge for me is to mobilize institutions in order to do the steps necessary to execute the projects that we have already won. So for me, that's first very tangible thing. And then the second one is to manage, like I said many times, well in advance public perception, so that we can shape it in the proper way, in the proper direction. And among that comes the execution of the initiatives that we have already launched, because I'm convinced that from strategic point we are on the right track. Now execution will make the difference.
Okay, Laura?
Yeah, the first one I would mention the public perception. Yeah, that's the first. The whole parties, whole involved stakeholders must work on both an EU level, national level, state organizations level, NGOs. The more, the best, because there's a lot of work to do, and it cannot be changed in a year, right? So it takes time and a lot of effort. The second legislation in Latvia's case, that's those legal hurdles are huge, and for us it's really a challenge. Everything else is doable. The infrastructure, the financing is really there. You have to take that from the EU. I don't think it's currently the challenge. Challenge is to be aligned on one page and to have public's buy-in, and everything else will go, I assume.
I'm not sure there's a huge amount to add, but for me, my top 3 priorities, the first one is kind of a cluster of priorities. It's regulation, political commitment, and financing. I think they all really go hand in hand, because the role of the state here is it can't be discussed. We need a lot of state implication in CCS projects. And the way to do that is to start with a serious target, commitment to a project pipeline, to supporting a project pipeline. With that, the regulatory framework will be forced to be revised, and we will have to come up with financing mechanisms, including absorbing EU funding, but also looking at other ways of leveraging private financing as well. The second one would be infrastructure, for sure. I can't underscore this enough, that we need to seriously start thinking about large-scale CO2 transport cross-border, and we really need to do it soon. And of course, public perception, I think, again, needs to be started very, very soon. Even to just understand what is the public perception. We actually don't have an EU-wide survey that's less than 10 years old that tells us actually what does the public think of CCUS and where are the concern areas and so on. And I think I would wrap all of this in, like, one of my top priorities, the top priority for me for CCUS is to look at it not as just a technology in itself, but it's part of a bigger portfolio of decarbonization. It goes alongside green hydrogen, it goes alongside electrification, and we risk to adopt a siloed approach by just talking about it. I think it needs to be looked at in the context of other technologies and measures to decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors. You know, we have CCS, we have alternative materials, we have, you know, innovations in production of concrete. So it's not a silver bullet. It never will be. And I think that's even a risk that undermines public perception as well, this idea that CCS is being talked about as just a silver bullet in itself.
Yeah, I saw from the Slido that actually the first feedback from the audience was financing, and I think I also share this opinion, because for all what we are talking about, even if it is changing public perception, if we have to go with pilot projects, if we have to explore further what are the geological formations and proof if they're suitable for carbon storage, we need funding. And if we look at the figures, I think, Rosen, you had 200 millions on your presentation. Was it 200 million?
So basically, just for one drill and to make a test sample, it's a 20 million euro
20,
project. And,
okay,
and the
million.
big project of carbon capture, transportation and storage, it's tens of,
Yes.
so hundreds of millions.
So we are again talking about the big scale investments, and whatever public funding is available, it will not be enough. So at the end, we will come to efficient and effective public-private partnerships in this area. I see also cost reduction and economic viability, which should point out also to something that this is a new technology and we need a constant innovation on all the stages, including storage, including transportation, including capture, and improving the sustainability and viability of each stage. And of course, okay, I should take note, legislation and regulation coming from a government, that's a good note. I mean, it's almost 100% feedback from the audience. So I think we have still some minutes for a feedback from the audience, if somebody would like to intervene. From the panelists. So it's time to say big thank you for the collaboration, for the input, for the knowledge sharing. I think it was quite interesting, and for sure, for such a targeted audience, it will follow up for all of us. Thank you.